Hello, I'm Patrick Cronin, Asia Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute. I want to thank you for joining us for a discussion on Asia's new managers and the free and open Indo-Pacific, Australia, Japan, the Philippines, and South Korea. Voices across the Indo-Pacific region often weigh in about the direction of U.S. policy, its reliability, predictability, and staying power. That's understandable given the role America continues to play in maintaining regional order. But what about the leadership of America's allies? Consistent with longstanding U.S. foreign policy, the Biden administration stresses ever closer relations among like-minded allies and partners to uphold a free and open Indo-Pacific. But do these allies have the same priorities as the U.S.? 4 U.S. treaty allies in the region have relatively new heads of government. South Korea's, the Philippines, and Australia's leaders have been on the job for just a few months. And while Japan's Fumio Kishida is no newcomer, he's only been prime minister for 10 months. How will they approach flashpoints, and how do they contribute to a favorable balance of power? To help address these and other questions about their policy priorities and where they're heading with a free and open Indo-Pacific, I'm delighted to be joined by 4 experts. Richard Hadarian joins us in Manila. He's a global commentator and writer, an incoming lecturer at the University of Philippines Asia Center. Minju Kim in Seoul is a reporter for the Washington Post in the Seoul Bureau. Haley Channer is just winding up a successful stint at Hudson as part of her Fulbright Fellowship. She's heading back home to Australia, where she's senior policy fellow at the Perth U.S. Asia Center. And Dr. Kei Koga is currently the Japan Fellow at the Wilson Center. He's an assistant professor at Singapore's Nanyang Technological University, and we're delighted to have all 4 of our guests today. I want to begin, if I could, with Minju Kim, who's up latest for this production and for this conversation. And Minju, I wondered if you could just start to set the scene about the new Yoon administration and its policy priorities and how it's approaching, especially its foreign policy and security policies as they relate to a free and open Indo-Pacific. So over to you, Minju.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be having this discussion with the distinguished panelists today. I'd like to walk you through what it's been like following the presidential elections in March and the first 100 days of South Korea's new president, Yoon Suk-yeol's government. Based on what I learned from my reporting as the Washington Post Korea reporter, which includes an interview we did with him shortly after his election victory in spring, and taking a close look at his foreign policy agenda, especially the North Korea strategies, and talking to other politicians, experts about their expectations and impressions of the new conservative government led by Yoon. So under Yoon's predecessor, Liberal President Moon Jae-in, South Korea's foreign policy was heavily focused on making peace with North Korea. But Yoon, who is a conservative president, has signaled a more hawkish and firm stance when it comes to North Korea. He also wants to expand South Korea's diplomatic roles beyond its North Korea focus to reshape and expand its relationship with the US, China, Japan, and Europe. He says that South Korea, which is the 10th largest economy in the world, will responsibly uphold the international rules-based order and play a greater role tackling global issues such as climate change and supply chain management. So one of the challenges that Yoon faces as he navigates these domains during his 5-year presidential term is that he has no experience in foreign policy or governing in general, because most of his professional life he served as a prosecutor. So in the competitive presidential election that happened in March, he was elected with the narrowest margin in South Korea's democratic history, which means he has a lot to prove in this deeply divided country. So he will face some significant challenges in governing as a political novice. I want to zoom in a little bit into the new South Korean president's foreign policy goals, which I'm going to look in three parts. Firstly, I will talk about South Korea's policies facing the US, which is the biggest security ally. And secondly, South Korea's biggest trading partner, China. And thirdly, the prospects of South Korea's relationship with its neighbor and its past occupier, Japan. To begin with, the key element of Yoon's foreign policy is revitalizing South Korea's alliance with the United States, which Yoon said has regressed under his predecessor Moon Jae-in, as Moon's ambitions for brokering a peace deal with North Korea made him wary of compromises in ties with China and Russia, the countries that are allies with North Korea. So, which was the source of some frustrations in Washington towards the Moon administration in Korea. One move that is taking place this year as Yoon took office after Moon is that the US South Korea joint military drills, which is happening this month, has gotten much bigger in scale compared to the past few years when the drills were scaled back to create space for diplomacy with North Korea, and because of coronavirus concerns. North Korea usually reacts very angrily to these drills. They call this a rehearsal for invasion, but South Korea and US say it's strictly defensive in nature. Yoon has actually vowed to expand South Korea's alliance with the US beyond the domain of security to cooperate on so-called new frontier issues like technology, supply chain resiliency, and climate change. The Yoon government has expressed its commitment for the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, IPEF in short. It is a framework for countries in the region to work more closely through common standards in areas like environment, digital trade, and supply chain. And this framework is an attempt at reshaping China's increasing influence in the region. So speaking of which, let's look a little bit more closely into Yoon government's approach to China, which is the Asian superpower. Yoon vowed a stronger political stance on Beijing while he was on the campaign trail, and he criticized the liberal President Moon Jae-in for going out of the way to placate China. But South Korea still walks a fine line when it's navigating its relationship with China, because it's the biggest trade partner of South Korea. And also, Seoul government does not want to risk a trade retaliation from Beijing like the one it saw in 2017 when South Korean companies suffered economic boycotts in China after the government in Seoul embraced a US anti-missile system on its territories. This probably explains why, although Yoon as a candidate criticized Moon for being too wary of China, we have yet to see a dramatic turn in the new South Korean government's approach to Taiwan and human rights issues in China. Yoon made this remark about China in an interview with us in April that South Korea needs to consider that the political and constitutional values of the two countries are, quote, completely different, and that South Korea has to respect those differences. And I'll move on to how South Korea's relationship with another Asian neighbor, Japan, will unfold under Yoon. So the relationship between South Korea and Japan is at one of the lowest points in decades. After disputes over the unresolved historical issues from the wartime. Yoon believes that this diplomatic feud between the two neighbors have actually backfired on the bilateral economic ties, which in turn hurts South Korean companies. He also expressed concerns about how it's become a sticking point in trilateral cooperation between US, Japan, and South Korea. Yoon has already started his outreach to Japan, so, but it still remains to be seen how it will unfold given how the historical disputes, they still remain unresolved. I hope this answers your question, Patrick.
I'm sorry, Menju, that was a great start to the discussion. We'll come back at you after we go through the rest of the panel to talk about some of the specific flashpoints and the relationships with China as well. But I want to turn to Manila and Richard Hadarian, who's also up late at night here to record this program and to tell us about the newest leader in the Indo-Pacific, President Marcos. And Ferdinand Marcos Jr. had a lot of baggage coming in with his family, and yet he's been surprising in many ways in terms of how he's governing. But I want to talk to Richard to let us hear from him about his insights, what he's seeing in the new Marcos government. So Richard, over to you.
Thanks, Patrick, for that kind invitation and kind introduction. I think I have a reputation of being a little bit ADHD when I give my presentation, but today I'm under the weather, so you're going to get a less hyper version of that. Well, as far as the Philippines is concerned, of course, never a dull moment, right? And after, exactly 50 years after Marcos Sr. declared martial law in the Philippines, now the sole son, namesake son, is back in the Malacanang. I think that it's a big statement in itself. And, just to flag this, I have a piece on Journal of Democracy on the return of the Marcoses. Please look at that, all the details that are there. So if you want a more detailed analysis, just go there. So I'm just going to get to the, the key points that I want to raise today. So if there's one word to really capture what has happened in the Philippines earlier this year after the presidential elections is the word restoration. I think that really captured what's going on here on 5 different levels. First of all, as I mentioned, is the historic aspect. 31 years since the return from exile in Hawaii, quite a luxurious one, and 50 years since the father declared martial law. Another Ferdinand Marcos is in power right now. Also on the level of political economy. So if you look at it, it was not only the victory of Marcos, but the victory of the entrenched elite in the Philippines and the duo of the Dutertes and Marcoses occupying the top positions in the government. You also see people who are getting a lot of good appointments. They're getting the juiciest parts of the state institutions and appointments. A lot of them belong to the Philippine political elite. So outsiders in that sense have not had a very good time, despite the fact that both Marcoses and Dutertes have tried to portray themselves as supposed political outsiders. Number 3, there is also a restoration to a much more technocratic government. Now, Marcos Jr. himself did not graduate from any university as far as we know, but he had stints in Oxford, PPE, and at Wharton. And that always gave him at least a kind of a panache or kind of a pretension to be a technocratic person. So back in the day when he was a congressman, back in the day when he was a senator, whoever bothered to talk to him, he will always try to project a technocratic image, try to throw out economic terms, right? And he's very much doing that right now, not only in terms of his own major speeches. So he spent the opening one third of his State of the Nation address on just purely economic issues, including budget deficit and so on and so forth. Things that we didn't see at all under Duterte, who knew admittedly zero as far as macroeconomics is concerned. But also he put a lot of good technocrats there, a lot of them from the university. I teach University of the Philippines, a lot of them American-trained economists in key positions of the government, including some economists who work under the bete noir of the Marcoses, the Aquinos. In this case, National Economy Secretary Arsenio Balisacan. We also have a restoration on the strategic level, which I think is the most interesting part. So many people try to portray Marcos as essentially Duterte 2.0, in terms of his foreign policy when it comes to US and China. I call him more like a Marcos 2.0 because I think he's much more similar to his late father than the previous Filipino president on so many levels when it comes to strategic issues. His late father, actually at the height of Cold War, maintained a very robust alliance with America, including maintaining massive American bases in Subic and Clark, the largest overseas bases for America outside the American continent. And yet, at the same time, he reached out and normalized with Mao Zedong, among the first US allies. In 1975, he visited Mao Zedong together with the family later on. He also established communication channels and economic ties with the Soviet bloc, including sending one of his top diplomats to establish relationship with Romania. That kind of multi-vector and ASEAN lingo multi-enmeshment strategy is very much central to how Marcos so far is approaching it, which is radically different from what we had under Duterte. So Marcos is not returning to the Aquino days or Ramos days of an American-friendly foreign policy, but nor is he returning to the Duterte days of anti-American, China-friendly, Putin lover foreign policy. It's a negation of a negation, to use the Hegelian term. But I think it's very much similar to what his father was doing back in the day. And let's see how it goes there. So clearly you see the psychological element. He has been in the shadow of his father. Interestingly, his national security advisor, a former mentor of mine, Clarita Carlos, was among the founders of the Foreign Service Institute in the Philippine Department of Foreign Affairs back in the day when his father was in power. So a lot of holdovers from his father time are there, including defense minister of his father, and Enrile, 99 years old, who's now his legal advisor. So this is surreal, but not Duterte style, a kind of a different one. That's why no dull moment in the Philippines. But culturally, this is an elite that is very Western oriented. Marcos Jr. plays saxophone. He's an aficionado of underground British music. You don't believe me? Talk to the British ambassador here. This guy is a geek on so many British stuff I had no idea ever existed, right? So different from Duterte, who barely visited the West, probably once in his life without a very good experience. You know, Marcos, 6 days after winning the presidency, he was in Melbourne partying with his family. Duterte, 6 years in office, didn't visit a single Western capital as the president of the Philippines. His family, bulk of them studied, and some of them more successfully graduated from American and British university. So this is a very totally different. I mean, the joke I make is that they're the Tiffany and Co. I mean, there's the pretensions to society, international society with them. And I think that's going to shape personal diplomacy that the Biden administration will be deploying towards the Marcoses. And just 2 months into power, he has met and exchanged with views with 4 high-level American officials, phone conversation with Biden, first foreign leader, Wendy Sherman, American ambassador, and Anthony Blinken, right? That's more than what Duterte had probably his first 3 years in power, right? Until he met Trump. So that just tells you how radically things are changing right now in the Philippines. Now, just to look at the scenarios and looking forward, I'll just try to be very quick about this. Let's look at the good, bad, and ugly. So what are the good things? One of the good things that is happening under Marcos Jr., I cannot believe saying this, but actually some good things are happening. One of them, which I predicted, was there will be a downgrade of the brutal drug war under Duterte, which was really, really besmirching our pretensions being a democracy. Thousands of extrajudicial killings. Horrible, horrible. That has slowed down significantly. And people that he put in charge of the drug war are constantly saying due process is important. We have to have safeguards, guardrails. Now, whether they will embody that fully in the next 6 years, of course, you can doubt that. But, you know, 6 years ago when Duterte was in power, right now, the killings were already starting. Now the killings are actually going down based on a lot of indication we're saying. I'm willing to take that any day. I'm glad about that. That's great. Also, what stopped is bashing America, bashing the West. What stopped is slavish rhetoric towards China. What stopped, practically stopped, is strategic relations with Russia. We had one major defense deal, the chopper deal. That's out of the window right now, and we're going to get American choppers, Chinook choppers. So the whole flirtation with Putin is completely out of the window. I think this is a good thing in light of the recent developments we're seeing. Also, in fairness to Marcos, he has been much more aggressive in pushing for more effective land reform, including giving moratorium and subsidies to the Philippine farmers, because Marcos, by the way, is also the agricultural secretary. So he wants to be a guy who brings inclusive development in ways none of his predecessors did. Will he be successful? I don't know, but at least the guy is trying. He's emphasizing that. I didn't see that before. I'm glad. I'm willing to take that. Sorry, our standards is not that high anymore, but I'm willing to work with the reality as it goes. But what are the things that are not so good? First of all, if you look at the State of the Nation address and inauguration address, copy paste that on a PDF, right? And type the words corruption, justice, human rights, democracy, nothing comes out, nothing, right? Which just tells you how much this guy wants to completely shun and avoid all the baggage issues, right? The corruption, the human rights violation, right? Even the corruption right now. So these are things that are not very encouraging as far as this administration is concerned, right? Now, it could also get ugly down the road because so far Marcos has not discussed constitutional change. He's more focusing on economics, his motto of unity, whatever that means. But I think if he sustains this political capital, he won 60% of the votes, almost more than anyone since his father. He still has a very dominant coalition. The opposition is totally in disarray. I don't know where they are. If he continues this momentum and has high popularity, I won't be surprised in 2 years from now, his cousin, Speaker of the House, Martin Romualdez, might push actually for a constitutional change. Then things could look more Erdogan. Then things could look more Orban, right? Which is one of the worries I raised in my journal article, Democracy, kind of a hybrid regime emerging in the Philippines. But so far, if you look at things, we're not there yet, and perhaps I'll be too unfair to be alarmist, but definitely I'm keeping a close eye on the possibility of them changing the constitution, because once we go down that road, it's a rabbit hole. It's a can of worms, and I'm going to be very worried for the Philippines, and perhaps I'll not be joining you from Manila next time, maybe somewhere else. But so far, not too bad.
Richard, thank you very much for that introduction to the Marcos 2.0 regime. And we'll look forward to following up with some discussions about how he's approaching issues like the South China Sea and China more generally. But I want to turn now to Haley Channer, who, although she's been in the United States now for a few months, is still keeping her finger on the pulse of her home in Australia and the new Albanese government, who doesn't have the panache of Bongbong Marcos, but he did get on the job right away when he got on a plane to Japan to attend the Quad leaders meeting only hours after being sworn in. And Haley, it's been a few months now for Prime Minister Albanese, but how do you assess his priorities and where he's taking Australian policy?
Yeah, thank you so much, Patrick. And I hope I can be as entertaining as Richard was. Richard said there was no dull moment in the Philippines. I think there's no dull moment with Richard. So I'm hoping to present the Australian side here. And if anyone has been following Australian politics in recent years, they'll know that we've had a lot of prime ministers. But it hasn't been, it's been a very long time since we've had a Labor government in Australia. In fact, it was back in 2013 that we had a Labor government, and I had a look in to see, what was happening in 2013. And President Obama had just started his second term. The Quad meeting, which was only then meeting at the official level, had long been abandoned. And South Korean pop band BTS had only just debuted. So it's been a very long time since we've seen a Labor government in Australia, and much has changed in our region and the world since then. Now we've got this global pandemic, wars returned to Europe, we've got the accumulating impacts of things like climate change, and we've also got this rising discussion about the potential for conflict over Taiwan. So the Australian Labor government has a very difficult set of strategic circumstances that it comes into the job to face. And we are seeing some slight changes in foreign and defence policy. A couple of things, though, that you won't see change are the Australian government's commitment to minilateral groupings in the Indo-Pacific. Things like the Quad and the AUKUS arrangement, the Labor government has already thrown its support behind. But having, reflected on the last couple of months and politics in Australia, there are three key changes, I think, that the international community will see under this Labor government. The first one is that this government has a much less confrontational public stance towards China, but that our China policies are going to remain substantively the same. The second point is that this new Labor government is really elevating the Pacific Islands much more than we saw the previous government do. Partly that is the result of timing and the fact that there was a China-Solomon Islands Security Pact signed early on in the piece, and so the Pacific just loomed quite large. And then the third point of difference between this government and the previous is that the relationship between Australia and the United States could actually improve, mainly because the Labor Party has much more similar stance on climate change to the Biden administration. However, the issue of a second Trump presidency in 2024 still kind of looms for the Australian public and Australian officials. So I just wanted to dive a little bit deeper into those three key areas of difference. So the first to note is that the Australian government's public approach towards China is different, but that the policies will remain the same. So after almost a decade of having a conservative government in power, the Australia-China relationship really entered a downward spiral. And that's because Australia took some policy decisions that really upset Beijing, and the Chinese Communist Party punished us for it. So one of those things was Australia in 2018 banned Chinese telecommunications company Huawei from bidding for Australia's 5G network. After the COVID pandemic, we also called for an independent investigation into the origins of the disease, and that also caused a lot of upset. And we really came under sustained fire on the trade front, with China banning everything from Australian beef to barley, cotton to coal, and table grapes to liquid natural gas. And that really made a huge impact on the Australian economy, but we stood fast. And not only did the relationship sour over the years, but also in the last 6 months or so leading into the Australian federal election, it really took a downwards spiral. Part of that was because the previous government was seeking to look tough on national security, and it came out saying, had some very tough comments on situation in Taiwan. So for example, the previous defence minister, who is now the opposition leader, Minister Peter Dutton, said that he couldn't conceive of a situation where Australia wouldn't come to the aid of the United States over a conflict in Taiwan. And obviously that caused a lot of ripples with China. Now, the new government hasn't echoed these sentiments. It hasn't said anything directly about what Australia would or wouldn't do over a Taiwan contingency. And it's really using the reset of the election to try and reset relations with China. So our new defence minister and our foreign minister have both had counterpart meetings with their Chinese equivalents. And that's the most senior level meetings that we've had with China for about 3 years. So we're finally getting some dialogue happening. But under the surface and behind the scenes, Australia's policy towards China is going to remain substantively the same. Don't expect us to basically back down from standing up for our interests in the face of sustained Chinese pressure. The second point that I wanted to make is that the Labor government is really elevating the Pacific Islands. So as I mentioned before, a few weeks prior to the Australian general election, Australia's Pacific neighbour, Solomon Islands, signed this security pact with China. Our now Foreign Minister Penny Wong described the offence that led to that deal as the worst Australian foreign policy failure in the Pacific since 1945. And from the outside, it really appeared as though Australia was completely blindsided by the deal. And it also reflected poorly on Australia's ability to relate to our Pacific Island neighbours. We appeared to be tone deaf to Pacific concerns like climate change, and we'd also cut aid spending. So to rectify that, the new Labor government has committed to spend an extra $370 million US in aid to the Pacific. And this money is really going to be spent on things that Pacific Island nations really care about: climate, defence training, and visa programs. Canberra remains the single largest development partner in the Pacific, but too often we've really had a transactional approach to the region, and we've failed to invest in personal relationships. So, for example, we've had very junior ministers or junior officials meet with very senior Pacific Island leaders. And in the Pacific, relationships are really paramount. So that is something that this new government is trying to address. So, for example, Foreign Minister Penny Wong visited the Pacific 3 times in less than a month, and Prime Minister Albanese has also visited Solomon Islands and met with Pacific Island leaders on the sidelines of the Pacific Island Forum. So expect to see the Pacific as a major focus of the Australian government, and Penny Wong has also gone so far as to say her priority as Foreign Minister are the Pacific and Southeast Asia, which is quite different to what the previous government said. And so my third and final point about what's going to be different under this Labor government is that the Australia-US alliance relationship is likely to improve because both governments are seeing more eye to eye on the issue of climate change, but the possibility of a second Trump presidency still casts a shadow. So Australia is a mining nation. Our top two exports are coal and iron ore, and most of our power comes from coal. Only a small percentage of our energy comes from renewables. The previous government sought to protect Australia's traditional mining industry and was very modest in its climate change commitments. In contrast, the Labor government won power partly off the back of its stronger climate action platform. Labor's policy is to reduce Australia's carbon emissions by about 43% in just 8 years by 2030. That is a big difference compared with the previous government, which had only committed to about 26 to 28% of reductions. We're also going to upgrade electricity grids and remove taxes on electric vehicles so that there's more take-up. So there's certainly more alignment on climate change with this Labor government in Australia and the Biden administration here in Washington, DC. And this also could lead to greater cooperation on climate change in multilateral groupings like the Quad. But just to end on this final note, there is still a lot of concern in Australia about the potential for President Trump to return in 2024. What President Trump had done in his last term was really undermine confidence in US leadership and really diminish its influence within the Indo-Pacific. And the outcomes that Australia would like to see are the return of a strong US leadership in our region, because that's what we feel really underpins regional security and stability, which is needed so much more now that tensions have risen greatly. So I'll leave it there.
Well, Haley, thank you very much. Three big points about the Australian government's change, but also a lot of continuity there as well. I want to turn finally to Professor Dr. Kei Koga and bring in Japan, our cornerstone ally in the Indo-Pacific and critical for thinking about the free and open Indo-Pacific.
Thank you very much for your introduction, Patrick-san, and then thank you for having me in this great panel. So as Patrick-san talks about, for Japan, it's not quite a new leader because the current Prime Minister Fumio Kishida has already inaugurated in October last year. So, but like that said, the Kishida's victory in the upper house election held in July has consolidated his political base. And considering that Japan would not have to hold the national elections in the next 3 years, the Kishida administration now have a wide window of opportunities to push forward what the administration wants to do. So perhaps the biggest agendas would be the constitutional revision, as well as the defense budget increase to enhance the military capabilities. But today, I'd like to first focus on the future of Japan's Indo-Pacific strategy and then its challenges. So on the Indo-Pacific strategy, as many have already identified, the Prime Minister Shinzo Abe created the free and open Indo-Pacific concept, the so-called FOIP, in 2016. It was a vague diplomatic doctrine at the beginning, but it was sharpened its content over time. The current framework is pretty clear. Its fundamental objective is to maintain and enhance the existing rules-based international order in the Indo-Pacific region that the United States and then its partners actually has constructed since the end of the Cold War. And the geographical area that Japan focuses on is actually stretching from the Western America to the Eastern Africa, that encompassing the Indian Oceans and also Pacific Oceans. And it has three pillars. The first, promotion and the establishment of rule of law, freedom of navigation, free trade, etc. Basically the international rules and norms. And then secondly, the pursuit of the economic prosperity, such as the connectivity and free trade agreements. And then lastly, the commitment for peace and stability, such as capacity building, and then HAD, humanitarian assistance, and then disaster relief program. So these are the kind of framework we have right now. And then as the Suga administration, the successor of the Abe, took over this strategic vision. And then also the Kishida administration right now also did the same. I mean, they actually took over this FOIP concept. As the Prime Minister Kishida stated in the Shangri-La dialogue this year, and it talks about the Kishida vision for peace, that the free and open Indo-Pacific is one of the most important agendas for the Japanese foreign policy now. And then but the differences between the Suga and also Kishida is that while Suga was preoccupied with Japan's domestic agenda at that time, such as the counter COVID-19 measure and the Tokyo Olympic and Paralympics, but Kishida has the more room to think through and add his own agendas to the current FOIP vision. And among them, the most obvious one is his emphasis on the economic security. The economic security legislation was passed in May this year, and which focused on the 4 pillars: supply chains, non-disclosure of patent, public and private partnership on the R&D, and core infrastructure. The basic principle is that the Japanese government will become more involved in the economic decision-making and regarding what types of supply chains need to be diversified, what raw materials need to be regulated, which technology should be promoted through public and private partnership, and what infrastructure needs to be protected. So these efforts contribute to the advancing Japan's FOIP vision, because since 2019, many have advocated for prioritizing the actions rather than talking about the concept of the FOIP. And given that most of the FOIP activities, such as the capacity building, infrastructure development, and free trade agreements, have been already existed since before the FOIP concept was created. And so the economic security is something that Japan could take a lead to push for the free and open Pacific, particularly the rules-based, the creation of the international rule and the norms. And the agenda has already been overlapped on the several new Indo-Pacific framework, such as Quad and IPEC. So the task is to what extent Japan can contribute to shaping these norms and rules on these areas, and this would become Japan's priority in the Indo-Pacific. And so, and also Japan is now formulating its national security strategy, and then they are trying to create it by the end of this year. And I believe that the FOIP and economic security will be highlighted in this document. And also another development is Japan's coalition building effort in the FOIP. Since Japan aims to maintain and enhance the existing rules-based international order, it requires the coalition to support that order. And obviously, the United States and Australia are closely aligned with Japan. And maybe their priorities might be different, but their direction is pretty much the same. As Harry already talks about, the Albanese administration states kind of the same course on China and also the Indo-Pacific strategy, and considering the strengthening the Japan-Australia relations, such as the reciprocal access agreement (RAA) between the two, and also their confirmation to proceed the ratification of the agreement and the pledge to upgrade Japan-Australia security critical relation. So I think these are Australia, the United States are the two kind of pivotal partners continuously for Japan's Indo-Pacific vision. And then also South Korea is kind of interesting, because the South Korea under the Yoon administration openly expressed the importance of the Japan-South Korea relation is really, really important. And then it shows its strong political will to create its own Indo-Pacific strategy framework, as Min-Ju-san said. And this is really clearly a positive development, because if we look back, the previous Moon administration consistently avoided using the term Indo-Pacific, and also deteriorated its relation, South Korea's relation with Japan on in the political and the military fronts, such as again the potential abrogation of the GSOMIA, and then some of the historical issues. So the current actions taken by the Yoon administration is now seen as the positive developments, and then Yoon's posture is seen as the first step to improve bilateral relations. The Philippine foreign policy is still uncertain. Richard said, Richard talks about the domestic front and also the broader direction. But then we are not sure to what extent the Marcos are actually going to strengthen its foreign policy in terms of the Indo-Pacific strategy. But then the Foreign Minister Hayashi has actively communicated with his counterpart, the Secretary Manalo, to continuously cooperate with the Philippines through 2+2 and the military and economic cooperation. And also another positive development of what I found in these two the bilateral relation is that the foreign ministers are actually talking about the Indo-Pacific strategy or Indo-Pacific concept a lot. While during the Duterte administration, we haven't actually seen that kind of the discussion on from the kind of public side. So I guess that this is the more kind of the positive development for the Japan Philippine relations. So I guess these are the big positives that we can see. Just kind of quickly, the negative side is I think Japan now has some of the domestic issue, which is the kind of the scandal that is many Liberal Democratic Party politicians had certain kind of the connection with the religious groups affiliated with the former Unification Church. And then this was actually spotlighted by the media. And then that was, we could actually talk about later this, but then this actually could create some kind of the negative impact on the Kishida administration. If this issue became a more kind of the bigger and also the entangled, maybe Kishida's administration needs to pay more attention on the domestic front rather than the foreign policy. And then the other one is the South Korea, the relation with the South Korea. Even though we see the positive sign, we are not sure yet what kind of the outcome we could actually get, because if you look at the domestic politics in South Korea, then the popular support, public support for the administration is actually rapidly going down. And then if the domestic issue becomes again in the South Korea big issue, then probably the Yoon administration might not push for its own kind of Indo-Pacific strategy or the improvement of the Japan-South Korea relations. So I think these are some kind of negatives.
Hey-san, thank you very much. Well, we've heard four great introductions to the four leaders that we're talking about today. And I want to drill down into some of the flashpoints and also relations with China before we end up talking more about the positive contributions in the visions that the leaders have toward the region. And Minju Kim, if I can come back to you and just back on North Korea. The Korean Peninsula right now faces a pretty grim outlook in terms of inter-Korean relations. So you rightly pointed out that the Moon administration focused on brotherhood, the kind of traditional progressive issue of reaching across for inter-Korean relations and elevating them in foreign policy and domestic policy for South Korea. And while the Yoon administration has put forward its so-called bold, audacious economic plan and other visions for economic rewards for commensurate denuclearization actions within a framework, nobody expects that to actually take place, unless you think otherwise in Seoul. That do you think the government really believes this? And if it's not going to take hold, not going to get traction, what we might be looking at, especially this month when we have the resumption of major military exercises by the alliance, is a fairly downward spiral of continued military tension and growing missile and nuclear capabilities in North Korea. You could end up, in theory, at the end of this one-term administration of President Yoon, with a North Korea that even surpasses Pakistan's nuclear arsenal, or at least approaches it. That is a couple of hundred nuclear warheads. People are talking about that as they think about an unrestrained, unbridled North Korea, and not just unbridled, but one that now seems to have an unconditional level of support from China. And this is also the context in which we're thinking about inter-Korean relations right now. It has to be considered in the context of growing rivalry between the US and China and friction and confrontation. And that's giving solace and comfort perhaps to Pyongyang, to North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un, who's seizing that to take advantage of it because he can deliver weapons better than he can deliver economic prosperity. That's a take here in Washington. But how does that look to you in Seoul? How do you think the Yoon administration is thinking about the realistic roadmap with North Korea?
Sure. So the audacious plan that you mentioned, it was revealed a couple days ago, earlier this week, and it's unfortunately it resembles the previous government's proposal to North Korea that has been rejected by Pyongyang because it wasn't attractive enough for them to give up their nuclear weapons. It's economic incentives, but nuclear weapons are seen as essential for the regime stability and for the regime survival even. So, but the Yoon administration has made a few outreach to North Korea so far, which was most significantly during the COVID pandemic, the COVID outbreak in North Korea. But North Korea hasn't responded to that offer either. So the prospect of this audacious new plan succeeding it doesn't look very bright, but the US South Korea military drills, I think it's going to spark angry reactions from North Korea again, which starts next week, and it can dial up tensions on the peninsula. And North Korea has also showed signs of getting ready for a nuclear test, which many experts were saying can happen anytime soon, now that North Korea has completed their preparations for a nuclear test. So North Korea has tested multiple missiles over the past few months, but a nuclear test will be another red line, which can, well, actually, because South Korea and US have limited options in responding to that, because the sanctions that are already in place are not working that effectively on North Korea, and it is still surviving without the economic incentives that South Korea has sought to offer. So I think the stalemate in the status quo is going to continue for the time being.
Well, stalemate is a good prediction, and yet I think you rightly point out there has to be some North Korean response. They've to the military exercises, because they've made that such a threshold issue, and they've objected to it in the past with provocations, or what we consider provocations, often missile tests. I think the nuclear test issue looks to be an issue for later in the year, maybe after the 20th Party Congress, partly because of monsoons and rains right now near the nuclear testing ground, and then the 20th Party Congress not alienating China. But toward the end of the year, that test that you say has been ready to go perhaps since April seems likely to move ahead, and that will be a new red line that they'll be crossing in terms of a seventh, maybe an eighth nuclear test. Especially coupled with discussions about usable tactical nuclear weapons, or some nuclear doctrine out of North Korea that suggests they don't want just deterrence, but maybe want some coercive ability out of these nuclear weapons. That's a very daunting sort of set of issues. And so I want to just ask you about how you perceive the Yoon administration's potential response, partly because what we've seen is a combination of strengthening South Korean defense, talking about the 3Ks in terms of the kill chain and the missile defense, capabilities, but also the latest discussions between the United States and South Korea talked about if there is a nuclear test, that the option of redeploying strategic assets on the peninsula, whatever that means, is on the table as well. And then finally, a very, very difficult issue I want to ask you about, Minju, is the support in South Korea, as far as I can see, remains very high for possible acquisition of a nuclear weapon by South Korea. I know President Yoon has already said, no, we're not pursuing that. But I wonder if, when you think about nuclear tests later this year, if you think about a growing arsenal out of North Korea, And as you point out, sanctions not really having an impact, especially given this U.S.-China confrontation. China's been much less willing to put pressure on Pyongyang, just the opposite. Do you think South Korea could, under Yoon administration, embark on that? And of course, the domestic weakness of the administration or lack of strength of political support, how does that affect the Yoon administration's defense capabilities? I know that's a lot there, but really I'm asking your kind of assessment of what you're expecting out of the Yoon administration vis-a-vis defense.
Sure, it's a great question. The defense capabilities in South Korea, I think, is going to be bolstered under Yoon administration. Actually, under the liberal Moon presidency, the defense spending of the South Korean government has increased, and I expect it to continue expanding under Yoon. But of course, the concerns about North Korea, it looms large over the decisions. And South Korea is currently in talks with the US about extending the extended deterrence against North Korea. And regarding the nuclear weapons issue, as you said, Yoon at the press conference this week said, pretty much ruled it out, saying that South Korea respects the NPT. But among the public, there is a growing sentiment that South Korea also needs its own nuclear arsenal. I think it's a mixture of the rising tensions in the world following the war in Ukraine and the China risks in the region, and also the South Korean public, especially the younger generation, are less sympathetic about feel the urgency, I guess, less about making peace with North Korea, because they grew up after South Korea has spent so many years basically in rivalry with North Korea. So there is the public view, but I think because when South Korea tries to step up as a nuclear power, it will face economic, I think, limitations and sanctions even. I am thinking the Yoon administration is still going to focus on bolstering the conventional arms. And in terms of what can happen after the tensions have really escalated, experts have told me that there is a risk of limited military conflicts along the inter-Korean border, like what we have seen during the previous conservative governments in South Korea. So I keep monitoring that as well.
And that would include potential kinetic action along the northern limit line in the maritime domain, where we could see some provocation out of North Korea. That's entirely possible, it seems to me. I do think one of the brighter spots here, Minju, is that this is pushing Korea and Japan toward identifying their common interests as needing closer discussions on contingency planning, well beyond the GSOMIA, the information sharing, the intelligence sharing agreement that currently exists. And I think that is at least one silver lining to these ongoing tensions, the stalemate that you point out that's likely to persist in the inter-Korean relationship. I want to move back to Manila and back to Richard to talk about some of the flashpoints that the Marcos administration is going to have to deal with, even if they haven't had to face a major crisis yet. Between the Taiwan tensions that exist, which spill into the South China Sea and very much, have questions about American military prepositioning and the enhanced defense cooperation agreement with the Philippines, and how that will unfold and continue to be pursued under a Marcos administration. But beyond that, Richard, just the approach that President Marcos can take as he's trying this balancing act with China policy. If China gets more aggressive in essentially asserting its perception of the 9-dash line and its essential ownership of most of the South China Sea, how is that likely to unfold in your view?
Thank you very much for that question again. I mean, I think Kay Koga-san talked about the uncertainties that faces in terms of the direction of Philippine foreign policy. But one reason I have been able to more or less, trace the trajectory of Philippine foreign policy, even under the disruptive administration of Duterte, are the structural constraints. If you look at approval rating, trust ratings of US and China, the spread is sometimes 100 points, right? So US has a net positive approval of around 70% and China's negative 30, right? Whoever is the president, even the most unabashed one like Duterte, could not ignore that. And on many occasions, if not himself, some of his top officials had to recalibrate their approach. Now, that is, of course, very relevant whenever, of course, foreign policy is never a priority in most democracies, but when China keeps on pushing the envelope, bullying Filipino fishermen, and the Philippine media, influencers, thought leaders keep on focusing on that, and then you have this long history of anti-communist, anti-China prejudice in the Philippines going back to the Spanish era and the American Cold War era, that presents a very much big limitations on how far Marcos can flirt with China. That was the reality under Duterte. That will be even a bigger reality under Marcos, right? And maybe this is too speculative, but the allegations is that Duterte was much more dependent on China in his rise to power and maintaining power than Marcos, who easily won the presidency, massive victory, and he has multiple options to sustain his power in ways that Duterte could not. Duterte came from the peripheries. China was really the only major power who was really behind him through and through. But Marcos has so many options on the table, and he's using that. So I think that menu of strategic options can give us an idea where the Philippines goes. But number two, which is even more important, in a New York Times piece back in 2017 alone, I wrote that this is not Duterte's personal army. So the role of the Philippine military establishment is very, very important. I constantly deal with them. I constantly deal with the defense minister's top officials throughout the years. And what's very clear with them is that, yes, we have no problem engaging China, but we're not blind. We know what's going on here. They're our number one external security threat, right? So, and you have a military establishment whereby 80 to 90% of the equipment is NATO grade, right? And little efforts to diversify that really didn't go anywhere because guess what? Philippines and China and Russia, zero major defense agreement really happened, even under Duterte, right? So these are all structural constraints that will shape how Marcos can go. And I don't think Marcos is crazy enough to try to pull off another Duterte, especially now that many Filipinos realize what we were facing is not debt trap, but pledge trap. China made huge pledges of investments. I have been saying this since 2018. They're taking us for a ride. They're taking us for a ride. So the other day, the Chinese ambassador himself used the word, we need more tangible and fruitful relationships. So even the Chinese cannot deny it that so Marcos cannot just pretend this is not the case, right? Now, I'm not saying Marcos is the epitome of patriotism and pro-American sentiments, but these structural factors are very important. Now, the Taiwan issue was very interesting. Even the Ukraine issue. In fact, the Philippines is the only Southeast Asian country, with the exception of the exiled government of Myanmar, that consistently voted in favor of Ukraine. Our voting record in the United Nations, overseen by our current Foreign Secretary and former UN Ambassador Manalo, was we stood by the Ukrainian people against Russia. Few people took notice of that because Duterte's big mouth kept on dominating the headlines. But actually, our record in the United Nations was pretty decent. Importantly, also on Taiwan, when Blinken visited the Philippines, right off the bat, Marcos Jr. said, I don't think Nancy Pelosi should be blamed for that. This has been there for quite some time. I don't think the Chinese were impressed by that. I think the Chinese, from the tantrums that Wang Yi was throwing not once but twice during the ASEAN summit, wanted the ASEAN to take their side and blame Nancy Pelosi. Right off the bat, Marcos said, you know what? It's not Nancy Pelosi's fault. This has been there. We have to deal with it. But, for the Philippines, it's tyranny of geography, right? The Luzon Strait is only 200 nautical miles, right? We're separate from southern China. You go to the northern Philippines where the Marcoses and my mom come from, right? We can hear Chinese radio, if we swim there. We have military facilities there. We have alliance entanglements, right? So that's why when it comes to Taiwan, whatever neutrality we want to project, It's not going to be the case once conflict happens, because China will automatically treat us as an R&R area for American military operations. Which brings me to the last point I want to raise here. I mean, there's so much to talk about, but one thing I really want to watch out for under Marcos is the EDCA negotiations, because the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement is something that very few talk about. Everyone talks about Mutual Defense Treaty. Everyone talks about the Visiting Forces Agreement, because Duterte tried to get rid of it, but he was essentially restrained by circumstances, internal dynamics. But the EDCA is really the real deal for me, because this is where we are going to give the Americans the rotational access and prepositioning of the weapons that they need in order to project power in areas close to the disputed areas. You have the Basa Air Base, which is close to Scarborough Shoal. You have the Bautista Air Base, which is close to Spratly Group of Islands. Some of these bases are closer to the north should there be a contingency in Taiwan. I think that's where the real negotiations will happen. And let's see how successful the Biden administration will be in convincing this administration to implement the agreement that was not fully implemented under Duterte. So I think that will be very essential in terms of interoperability and where the two countries are going. But in the meantime, with the Japanese, we have now two plus two meetings. We have mutual logistics agreements. I think we're pushing that relationship to higher levels. Even Duterte was comfortable with Japan. That's a relationship that has a lot of potential. Another one that no one talks about is the Korean relationship with the Philippines on the defense front. A lot of our modern armaments are coming from Korea, including FA-50s, including some of the new warships we're going to get. There are even discussions that down the road, the Philippines can get the 4.5 generation fighter from Korea. Few people talk about it, but Philippines is a major market from Korean defense exports, right? Down the road, along with Thailand and Indonesia. Then, of course, Australia, which is always a big surprise. I mean, I used to spend a lot of time for Australia for a lot of reasons, But one thing I realized is that barely we talk about each other in Australia and the Philippines, right? We all talk about Americans, but not each other. But interesting thing is that the Philippines has a status of forces agreement with Australia, right? There's so much that binds the two countries legally, politically, language-wise, and yet it's one of the most untapped, underdeveloped relationships out there in the region, which is scandalously persistent. And I hope that will change under the Albanese administration.
Thank you, Richard. And, you're right about Korea. They've become a major arms sales provider, now rivaling the UK, surpassing Italy and moving up the chain. I want to turn back to Haley and talk about really not just the Pacific Islands, although that's crucial. And of course, many of us were still surprised, even though a few were not, at the kind of multilateral security pact that China was peddling, and what they did with the Solomons as well. It certainly galvanized Australia, and as you mentioned, Foreign Minister Penny Wong dedicated a lot of time and effort, and it is focused heavily on the South Pacific as well as Southeast Asia. But it's the Taiwan crisis that's still gripping the larger Indo-Pacific, and I think internationally, outside of the Ukraine war, it's seen as such a major point of confrontation. And as Richard was just suggesting, you had Foreign Minister Wang Yi trying to project a Chinese narrative that this is American provocation. This is America changing the status quo by sending the Speaker of the House, not sending, but by having the Speaker of the House for the second time go to Taiwan. And indeed, that's one of the points back to Wang Yi and to the Chinese that, the administration didn't send Nancy Pelosi. The legislative branch is truly independent. And by the way, we don't accept the international limitations on the Taiwan Strait that China wants to place. It wants to call it essentially a domestic passage rather than international waters. That's not accepted by the United States. And meanwhile, we're talking about a new free trade, if not a free trade agreement, at least a increased 21st century trade initiative with Taiwan. And that's supposed to be something that is negotiated over the next year between US and Taiwan. That's sure to incur further wrath from Beijing. So as the tensions continue to heat up between the US and China, Haley, if that's the trend, and given the fact that you've pointed out that, Canberra's interested in continuity in that policy in many ways will strengthen relations with the Biden administration, but they don't want to be confrontational. It seems like it's going to be hard to avoid confrontation between how China's behaving and between the tensions on the Taiwan issue. So can you just tease out for us your suppositions about how might the Australian government approach even increased tensions on Taiwan? They're already high, but even short of a war, but nonetheless increased tensions and possibly some new crisis that could occur?
Mm. Well, the first thing to say is, yeah, Australia doesn't want to be caught in the middle, just like probably every other country in the Indo-Pacific region. I think what we've seen happen in Ukraine was really shocking and has also made the prospects of war in the Indo-Pacific a much more visceral thought for people to have, a much more real thought for people to have. And Australia has been a very staunch ally of the United States. I mean, there's a line that we use, which is that Australians have fought alongside Americans in every single war since World War II. We're in Vietnam, you know, we've been in Korea. So we just got out of Afghanistan with you. So obviously Australians have been seeing eye to eye with the United States in years past. However, this issue of Taiwan is extremely concerning because of how major the conflict could be, and the fact that a conflict also could be mainly fought in the grey zone, and China could create a fait accompli where it has already taken over Taiwan and really there's no battle to be had, or that the questions about how to fight that battle would come through an economic or trade war, which would be equally devastating in a number of ways, including impacting people's livelihoods and quality of life. You know, the previous government made a lot of very strong statements about Taiwan, and I think it is justified to say that Australia would need to have some sort of role in the conflict because it would draw in every country in the region. I mean, Japanese islands are only 100 kilometers or so off Taiwan, and so if the United States and Japan were involved in some sort of conflict, and Australia has rotational Marines in Darwin and other, you know, joint US-Australia assets and facilities, it's very difficult to see how we wouldn't become involved. And something that I found quite interesting is, you know, there's a debate in Australia about whether we should or shouldn't. A scholar called Hugh White has penned an article called Sleepwalk to War, which is about the potential for Australia to just get involved in a conflict without really wanting to. But the Australian public seems to be coming on board with the idea of Australia actually being involved in any kind of conflict. So there was a Lowy Institute poll that was recently released that asked the question, in the event of a military conflict between China and the United States, should Australia support the US, remain neutral, or support China? And this question was asked this year and last year. And this year, Australians said 46% said Australia should support the United States. 51% said Australia should remain neutral. And last year, what they said was only 41% said Australia should support the US, whereas 57% said we should remain neutral. So even within the general population, Australians are starting to think that the tide of opinion is turning against China. This is a trend that has been going on for years. I mean, we do have a very large Chinese diaspora in Australia, and we're a very multicultural society. But Australian business interests were heavily impacted by China banning our imports, and a lot of businesses are starting to diversify now. Also, I mean, we suffered because China wasn't sending Chinese students to Australian universities. So I think that public opinion is seeing aggressive Chinese actions in things like its territorial disputes, also just its human rights abuses and things like Xinjiang, the treatment of the Uyghur population. And we are taking a tougher stance on China. So I think, you know, as much as we wouldn't want to be involved, and it's a horrible reality to think about after especially what we've seen in Ukraine, I don't think that Australia would have any other option but to try and influence positively the outcome of any kind of conflict like that.
Thank you very much. I want to move on to Kason and get his take on Prime Minister Kishida and how he views both tensions over Taiwan, but also how he's reading Xi Jinping's assertiveness and where this is going. For instance, Kason, one of the recent brand new book, in fact, by Hal Brands and Michael Beckley, maybe you haven't read it, but you've seen his argument about we've reached peak China. China's been peaking in power, in fact, and the real problem is China's growing now weakness in the coming years. But this could manifest itself in terms of more assertiveness over issues that are seen as part of its core security, like the Taiwan issue. But I just throw that out as one current theme in the US discussion. How do you think the Prime Minister of Japan is viewing China in its potential assertiveness in the region, including especially over Taiwan?
Okay, thank you very much for interesting questions. And I think the Prime Minister Kishida and Japan itself actually is seeing the, definitely the China's increasing assertiveness. And then I think the basic stance that Japan wants to pursue or wants to actually be based on is that Japan wants to engage with China. I mean, Japan doesn't want to actually have the unnecessary conflict or tensions with China in the many fronts, like in East China Sea, South China Sea, and also even the infrastructure development, those kind of non-military issues. But I guess the reality is actually going the other way, and then the Japan is actually facing the more kind of the threats, and then the China's assertiveness is not like mitigated as the Japan wants to. So in that sense, the Japan needs to actually think about how to respond, how to actually constrain or like shape for the Chinese behavior. And with regard to, I think that's why the Japan is constantly engaging like in the many levels. Like yesterday, there was the National Security Advisor Akiba actually went to the talk to the Yanjiche about the many issues in Japan. The details are not like the classified. I mean, like not class is not the unclassified. But I guess the thing is that the communication channel needs to be open, and then they have to actually talk to each other. But at the same time, again, the tensions actually is increasing. So I believe that the national security strategy that Japan is going to formulate this December, and also the national defense policy guidelines that Japan is going to simultaneously issue, it will be focusing on the China, and then how we gonna actually respond to the Chinese behavior. The one is definitely the military, increasing the military capability. We need to actually have the deterrence effect on the China. So the defense budget increase, and also the some of the counter attack the capabilities needs to be considered. And the other one is the international rules and norms, which is actually not like the sufficient to constrain as far as we know, but they are still like we need to work in creating those rules and norms to constrain or like talk about the Chinese kind of sort of behavior. So I guess that's the kind of the general posture that Japan is going to pursue. And on the Taiwan Straits, I guess the Japan is pretty much aligned with the United States. I think the Pelosi's visit to Taiwan timing is actually debated. I guess there's some kind of I mean, we need to calculate, we need to evaluate the diplomatic cost and then the aftermath. Then because this actually gives some of the reasons for China domestically to push for their kind of military exercise and then do whatever like they want to do in the Taiwan. And then even if the international the community criticizes it, maybe like China is not going to listen to that, but they have some kind of justification domestically, and then that actually creates more kind of tension over that. So the timing is debated, but like principally, like it's not like wrong for Pelosi to visit the Taiwan, and then the Pelosi and also the U.S. citizens, U.S. politicians has every right to visit the Taiwan. So in that sense, I guess the principally the Japan is always with the United States, and then as you actually see the G7 statement was the kind of the statement Japan eagerly supported, and also the Japan when the Prime Minister Kishida met the Pelosi in Japan. They actually talked about Taiwan Straits, and they criticized heavily about the Chinese kind of missiles fell into the Japanese EEZ, exclusive economic zone. So I guess that's the kind of posture. I mean, like we need to actually still like we hope that the Japan China relations, as well as the Japan US China relations, could have some improvement. But at the same time, we have to prepare for the worst.
Well, it'll be very interesting to see how China's portrayed in the forthcoming national security strategy, where it's bound to figure very prominently, as well as on the national defense plan. I want to turn back. We have about 15, 20 minutes at most. And I want to go back briefly to each of you to just follow up on a couple of key points and project ahead. And Minji Kim, you've been a great sport to hang in here late at night with us, and thank you very much. I want to ask you a kind of a two-part, two different issues. One of them relates to the management of a careful China policy at a time when South Korea is going to be doing more for its own defense vis-a-vis North Korea, at least, and that's going to probably incur some reactions from China, if not necessarily moving away from the three no's policy about the THAAD batteries, but nonetheless, more defenses is sure to incur some response from China. And that could lead into the economic sphere that you pointed out at the beginning of this program. Clearly, the Yoon administration wants to try to avoid new economic pressures out of China, just the opposite. But it may be unavoidable. And I think the question on South Korea policy positively is here you have the Yoon administration willing once again to assert a global Korea. We already heard on arms sales. Of course, President Yoon came in on the scene in many ways by going to the Madrid summit internationally and being there at the NATO meeting on a new NATO concept, along with Japan and Australia, New Zealand leaders weighing in as the Indo-Pacific observer wing, but basically putting the imprimatur on a new NATO concept over the next 10 years that looks at this systemic challenge out of China. So there's a built-in friction between wanting to play a global role and yet wanting to maintain good relations with China. How do you see the Yoon administration most effectively trying to find its place internationally? It's clearly been invited to some G7 meetings. At the G20, it's a possibility. It's talking about human rights, as you mentioned. It is playing a bigger role, and it should. Maybe it's in the technological space, and there, I think, clearly, we saw this with President Biden and President Yoon, very interested in supply chain security, semiconductors. This could be an area where he plays maybe the most positive role globally and regionally. But I wonder how you see this manifesting itself in the coming months and years for the Yoon administration. How do you think the Yoon administration is thinking that they have found their niche in terms of defining this pivotal global role? And how does that play vis-a-vis a balance of power with China? I know that's a complex set of questions there, but the relationship with China unfolding and Korea's global role unfolding under the Yoon administration, how do you think they're thinking about these issues right now?
Sure. So the Yoon administration has made it clear that South Korea has to play a bigger role in the international arena, especially that the cultural, economical influence of the country has really grown. But people who ask for South Korea's bigger role in diplomacy says South Korea hasn't caught up with its economic and cultural might in the diplomatic arena. So Yoon has made pledges to do so under the slogan of global pivotal state. But I think it remains to be seen how he will navigate that. One thing that happened recently was Yoon was the only leader in Asia who did not have a meeting with Nancy Pelosi when she was on a trip to this region. The explanation was that he was on a staycation in Seoul, but experts and critics were saying Yoon was deliberately trying to avoid a meeting with Pelosi because she was coming directly after a meeting with Taiwan. And of course, it is understandable. I mean, South Korea has nothing to gain from angering China, the biggest trade partner. But the Pelosi meeting thing was seen as a missed opportunity in South Korea. And I think it's probably because Yoon is a political novice with very little experience in the diplomatic arena. So I think we are probably going to take a little bit more of a time to see how his views of how to deal with the US-China rivalry and South Korea's role in diplomacy is going to shape up.
Yes, when you're managing the balance of power, a staycation may not be the best approach. And yet I understand fully the sensitivities of the Taiwan issue in Seoul and elsewhere. That's great. I want to turn back to Richard and get his sense of where the Marcos administration, where President Marcos, how he thinks maybe about a balance of power unfolding in this region under his tenure. I mean, what can he, as the president of the Philippines, who's thinking still mostly domestically, getting the economy going, the restoration that you pointed out, but how does he view, his tenure, the balance of power shifting around Southeast Asia, but around the Indo-Pacific more broadly, Richard?
Yeah, I mean, sorry, thank you for the question. Yeah, I mean, as far as Marcos is concerned, I mean, one thing we have to keep in mind is the element of agency, right? So I've talked a lot about the agency of the Philippines. One of the things that always annoys me when people talk about Southeast Asia is as if they're a bunch of, pawns on the chessboard and the big powers will toss them around. So they have agency, and we have seen, even with Duterte, maybe not in the best way he exercised it, but he had agency, right? He scrambled the ball game and tried to impose his agency in the picture. Well, in the same way, I think a lot also matters, Patrick and colleagues, in terms of how the Biden administration approaches Marcos. I think so far they have done a very good job, right, of really focusing on areas of shared concern without getting too much into areas where there could be divisions and problems and disagreements, etc. I think if they continue that, most likely next year, there's going to be a White House visit by Marcos Jr., quite surreal, but it's also going to be the first by a Filipino president in almost a decade. I think the last time a Filipino president was in the White House was 2012 or something like that, under former president, late President Aquino. So it matters how the Americans will engage, the Marcos presidency, right? It also matters how the Chinese will engage him. I think the Chinese got quite a rude awakening early on when they realized this is not another Duterte, that they will have to really gain the trust and confidence of this administration. I mean, just weeks into power, he flexed his muscle. And one of the things he did is, first of all, he didn't give the defense ministry to Sara Duterte, the presidential daughter, ex-presidential daughter, because he wanted to give it to a much more veteran person, a former general, also from the north of the Philippines. He gave the foreign ministry not to a kind of a loyalist, but gave it to a career officer, the first time in almost 20 years, right? Also, just a month into office, he suspended 3 major projects with China, telling them, hey, you cannot pledge strap us here. If you're going to invest, bring in the money. Let's see what's going on. But don't just throw around pledges and leave these projects hanging in the air. I think that was also quite a good move. So I think Marcos is essentially telling the big powers, what do we have to offer? Let's go from there. But definitely, I'm comfortable with keeping a good relationship with Americans in ways that was not the case with Duterte. So what I'm saying here is that nothing is set in stone. There are trend lines, there are structural limitations, but how the big powers approach the Filipino president and other key Southeast Asian countries will be also very much important to how the country goes. Now, I think down the road, the vision that Marcos has is to make the Philippines once again a pillar of ASEAN. That was the case in the 60s and 70s. We were one of the founding countries. You put the population of Indonesia and Philippines together, that's half of ASEAN population already, right? We're projected to be the 3rd or 2nd largest economy in the region in the coming years. So I think the Philippines wants to be a kind of a middle power, a full-fledged middle power down the road. And I think that's the kind of legacy that Marcos wants to leave 6 years down the road, or at least the strategic minds within his administration. So I think the Philippines want to have more agency, want to be more of a middle power, not just another small power, but it wants to get the kind of respect, recognition that it wants, and it felt it was not getting in the past. The Chinese took Philippines for granted in the previous years. America took the Philippines for granted also before Duterte. But I think that's changing right now. And I think that's good because it also contributes to strategic maturity of ASEAN countries like the Philippines.
So a global pivotal power in South Korea, a sort of rising power here, middle power in the Philippines. What about Australia, Haley? How does the Prime Minister look at Australia's role in maintaining a regional balance of power? And how, if I can just add into that a specific question about AUKUS, because the Australia-UK-US defense relationship is critical, not just because of the nuclear propelled submarine part of that, but also maybe the bigger part is the sort of commitment to, over the long term, for the scientific and technological capabilities of China manifesting themselves fully, and maybe rising, making rising Australia a much more significant factor over the coming decades in this region. Now, that's looking out far ahead. We have to look ahead month to month here and year to year. But how do you see Canberra thinking now in the change of government about the balance of power in the years ahead?
Well, Patrick, I really like to think that Australia is maturing in its foreign and defence policy approaches and how it actually relates to the region that it's in. You know, for such a long period, Australia was always seeking security from its region by reaching out to traditional powers like Five Eyes countries, US and UK. Now I think it's finally starting to see its place as seeking security with and from, with the region rather than, from it. And that part of that trend is Australia forming new minilateral groupings like AUKUS. But actually, in the last 10 years alone, Australia has joined 10 different minilateral groupings. Some of them include the United States, some of them don't include the United States. So AUKUS obviously does, the Quad does, but Australia also has these minilateral agreements with Japan and India, also one that's India and Indonesia. It's also trying to reach out more to countries like South Korea and Vietnam, because I think Australia is seeing that the security situation is getting worse. It needs a more networked approach to its region. And this new Labor government, I think, has a more sophisticated approach. It understands, having been in opposition for 9 years, it had a lot of time to prepare. And now it's kind of like bolted out of the gate. It wants to reestablish Australia's presence in the Pacific. It's refocusing on Southeast Asia. And it's also kind of championing the fact that it is a multicultural society and it wants the region to see itself in Australia, which I think is a beautiful way to kind of capture the essence of what Australia should be about, which is it should be part of its region, not seeking security from it. In terms of the AUKUS agreement, there's positives and minuses with it. I mean, originally we were seeking a submarine agreement with Japan, that fell through. And then we sought it with France, also a regional power in a different way, that also fell through. So there's a much more pressure on Australia this time around to make sure the AUKUS agreement happens. There was some negative kind of branding with AUKUS because it looks like Australia is returning to its roots of seeking security from traditional Five Eyes powers. And I don't know that could have been avoided because we couldn't get the same kind of capability that we were seeking and needing from France. Frankly, the public perceptions shifted in terms of being more willing to accept something tougher like a nuclear-powered submarine. But potentially there's still scope for Australia to work with other partners in the region on some of the things that AUKUS is doing on the emerging technology space. So whether that's quantum, artificial intelligence, undersea warfare, we could be working with Japan, South Korea, India, potentially even Indonesia on some of these really core capabilities. Thinking about the Philippines, the Philippines is one of the only countries that has a status of forces agreement with Australia. And we should be doing much more with the Philippines, I think, because it is an important player. And I hope that Australia will look more to South Korea and the Philippines in future.
Well, another rising regional power. We really do have new Asia managers on the scene here and rising powers. And I think in Japan, they've been playing this role well before Kishida became prime minister. But Kei Koga, how do you think Prime Minister Kishida is looking at the evolving balance of power during his tenure, especially now that he's got at least 3 years before the election would be held? He has his new documents coming out. He's committed to a substantial increase in defense spending. But how is he looking at the regional architecture? Is it going to be a clear path toward this free and open Indo-Pacific view and vision that he has, or how do you project it ahead?
Thank you again. It's actually really difficult question to answer right now. But I guess the perception that the Kishida administration has right now is actually pretty much similar to the Abe administration or Suga administration. The international security environment is getting more and more severe, and then they need to actually adjust or stabilize the balance of power in the Asia and also in the Pacific. And then Japan actually pursued the three types of the policy towards the kind of creation or nurturing the security architecture in the Indo-Pacific. One is definitely the Japan's own kind of military capabilities or defense capabilities, and the U.S.-Japan alliance, and also unilateral alliances with the kind of multilateralism led by the ASEAN. So these are the kind of the security concept that Japan pursued. But increasingly, the Japan or the Kishida or many people in Japan actually see the ineffectiveness of the current regional security architecture to push back the Chinese assertiveness. I mean, ASEAN is actually the one core multilateralism that the Japan supported for a long time, but it actually couldn't manage the substantial issues, and also it couldn't manage the Myanmar. It's actually have difficulty in managing the Myanmar issue right now. And also the U.S.-Japan alliance is strong, but it does not actually do everything. It actually couldn't actually deter the China in the South China Sea or the other places. Even if you create the other kind of networks, it's still like insufficient. So what I think the Japan is going to do is putting more resources in its own military capabilities or defense capabilities, and also the bilateral or like unilateral security cooperation with the Australia and then perhaps the UK, because they are now like thinking about the new RAA with the UK in the Indo-Pacific. And also possibly the Philippines. The Philippines has as Richard said, the Philippine-Japan relations are strong, and then they have the AXA, and they have also the defense cooperation and then communication line 2+2. So I think they are trying to, if possible, they are trying to create the new defense pact with the Philippines, and also Japan is trying to strengthen the bilateral relation with some of the Southeast Asian countries like Singapore and Thailand, because as they concluded the defense equipment and the technology transfer agreements as well. So I guess this kind of bilateral network is going to be more important for the Japan's security policy, while like actually support the multilateralism. They don't want to actually damage the ASEAN unity or centrality, but then at the same time, I think Japan is more kind of focusing on the unilateral or the bilateral and its own capability to maintain the favorable balance of power in the Pacific.
Well, I think all four of these countries have been seeking new network security arrangements as well as economic arrangements. The United States has been supporting that. I don't think they're going to be promoting necessarily in Australia, South Korea, Japan, Philippines quad. We have quite a few pacts and quads already. But I do think these four countries are going to matter a great deal in the coming years when you think about a free and open Indo-Pacific or peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula, Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, and across the Indo-Pacific. So I really thank you for enriching us with your insights and your great discussion here across time zones. Richard Hadarian in Manila, Minju Kim in Seoul, Haley Channer, who's and Kei Koga, who is fortunately going to be in Washington a number of months here at the Wilson Center. Thank you all for your great contributions, and good day.